Okay, thank you all for coming. I have lovely 2 slides to present to you all. So I am Matt Crowder. I am a software engineer at Appian. We'll actually just be down the road in 2 weeks. Right now we're in Reston. I actually just started there 2 months ago. So far it's pretty good. I am located at mcrowder65.com. That's actually just going to redirect you to dev.to, which is my blog that I have posted on. Actually, not as much, but Dev is a pretty cool blogging platform over Medium in my experience recently. So I'd recommend checking that out. mcrowder65 is my handle for everything. So if you want me to follow on Twitter, or if you want to email me after this, ask me any questions, or just feel free to come and talk to me. It's up to you. I'm also the co-organizer of Nova.js. Can I get a raise of hands? People who've been to a Nova.js meetup? Okay. So next year when I'm back, I want everybody to raise their hands saying they've been there. So we are actually looking for speakers. We will be indefinitely located in hosting in Tysons at Appian starting in next month in July. So if you are interested in speaking, please come and talk to me. And then if you're interested in going, if you just go to novajavascript.com, it'll redirect you to the Nova.js meetup. I like to run with my dog, and I like to lift without my dog, and I liked my wife. I put that in there without her recommendation, just so you all know. And then the second slide is my dog. So this is Charlie. He is a golden retriever, and we run a lot together. Okay, so now I guess I will just display this while I talk a little bit. So by raise of hands, can I see who is using GraphQL in production at work right now? Okay, so that's like almost the same amount of hands as people have been in Nova.js. So I didn't raise my hand because I used to use it in production at work, and then now we don't use it in my current job. I don't know if we will ever use it, but that's okay because it's not for everybody, and I'll get into that. So what is GraphQL? GraphQL is a query language. I don't necessarily like the idea of why it's called GraphQL because like you think SQL and you're like, oh, it's this language, and but then it's like it's intermixed with MySQL, which is the database, and then people think like, oh, GraphQL is a database, but really it's just a query language, and the idea is it's just it's a JSON-like query language, and in order to support GraphQL, you have to have a REST server running. So to make GraphQL requests, you make REST requests. So really, it's just you make a post to a REST server that has, you can call it whatever you want, but generally people do /GraphQL. And then that /GraphQL REST endpoint, it knows how to handle the GraphQL query that you're sending it. So does that make sense so far? So okay, yeah. We got some good ones. Okay. So, right, so people think of it as a server, but really it's a language, it's a query language. So there's servers that support GraphQL. So if you think about it, you can't do client-to-client GraphQL communication. So like a phone can't hit another phone with a GraphQL server. Like maybe if you can host an HTTP server, then you can host a GraphQL server. So maybe you can on a phone. I don't know. And then you can use GraphQL basically anywhere that can make HTTP requests. Fortunately and unfortunately, it is relatively easy, but it's not as easy as just REST, where you just make the HTTP request. With GraphQL, so there's libraries like Apollo or Relay or Urkel, which actually just got upgraded. They have built-in caching and like optimistic caching, and then they also have like real-time updates that are just automatically baked into the libraries. So for example, so somebody comes out and they say, hey, Svelte, it's this really cool new library, and it's like, but turns out your whole business is relying on GraphQL. Well, it turns out that there's been like several years worth of GraphQL work done with React, and Svelte doesn't have any kind of GraphQL work done with it. So it's kind of hard to, so it's good to go with like the more modern frameworks because they'll generally have GraphQL libraries that support them. So why do you use GraphQL? So the nice thing about GraphQL is that it allows you to expose a wide array of services. So when I worked, I used to work for Walmart Labs in Reston, and so people don't realize this, but Walmart is a ginormous company with a ton of legacy. People always talk to me about like, oh, Capital One has like so much. It's like Walmart has so much. So yeah, it's like petabytes and petabytes. But all that's like in COBOL, like, and just like legacy stuff. Like, but yeah, Capital One's banking, right? So it's like, I'm sure there's lots of COBOL. So you have all these legacy services, and so one example was like we had to FTP like a file because it was which like wasn't fun. But so GraphQL lets you have an abstraction over FTP. You can have it over a database, have it over a REST server. And the idea is that you make one call to your REST server that supports a GraphQL endpoint, and then that GraphQL endpoint is on the server, and then it reaches out and it grabs every single thing together and it brings it back to you. So ideally, so the alternative, if you think about it, a lot of times there'll be a client, and the client will make, say, like 9 or 10 requests to aggregate all this data together. So it's client server, client server, client server, client server. With GraphQL, you make one request to the GraphQL server, and then that GraphQL server ideally has a wired connection because it's in like the same it's in the same network, or it's already on the server, and it can grab all the other information and bring it back a lot faster because you only had to make one request to the server. So GraphQL is great. I would say the best situation you could be in is if like your backend team was like, yeah, we hate REST, we're just gonna write GraphQL for you. And because there's also, if you have a REST server and you know exactly how, so if you know exactly how your data is going to be shaped over time, do not use GraphQL. It's not going to benefit you at all. It's better to use it if you have a lot of data in different places and you need to bring it together and you're not sure how the shape of it's going to change over time. What's also nice about GraphQL is that it provides, so JavaScript is loosely typed. And when you make GraphQL queries, you see the exact shape and type of everything that you're getting. So that's nice, but it's still not worth it just to add GraphQL to anything. So there are a lot of examples of like, hey, here's like this full stack GraphQL tutorial. And they build it over a Mongo database, which is like cool because you're learning it. But don't ever do that just to have it because it's not going to be worth it because just building GraphQL over Mongo, it provides no benefit. You could just query it with a REST server with HTTP calls. OK, so does anybody have any questions so far? Now I'm going to like get into like the nitty gritty of it. So questions. Oh, and then so the thing about GraphQL too is that if you are one owning it, it was really nice using it, but it still was a pain because it was another thing I had to worry about because it was like another server. I think it was worth it, but it still was just like, oh, now we have this other server we have to worry about. And when you work with Walmart and you have your own version of Kubernetes, things can get unfortunate. So
pretty much GraphQL can collect data from multiple sources,
yep.
Aggregate it together, and return it back to you.
Yep.
So what is it, a language or is it a database like Neo4j?
So I'm not entirely sure what Neo4j is. I think Neo4j might host Graph. It's okay. Right. Okay, yeah, so Neo4j is a graph database. So you could write, so say you had Neo4j, that's a database, and then say you had another Mongo database, and then you had like something you had FTP over a REST server. Then GraphQL can like call each of those. Like you have a server.
GraphQL is language like SQL?
So you have a server that exposes a REST endpoint that accepts GraphQL requests. And then it interprets those GraphQL requests, and it knows like what to do with it and to aggregate data based on that request that it just got.
Let's say, simple use case, I've got a REST API, and I'm going to ingest your GraphQL request. So I get your request.
Mm-hmm.
There's a syntax for format?
Yeah.
And is there a spec for that somewhere?
Yeah, so I'm guessing just GraphQL.com has it. So I'm going to go through an example using Happy.js. It's on Node.
So the question, back to the question. So the question was, let's say I've got a customer table with order numbers, and I want to just execute a GraphQL query.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got a query format, and then there's something that issues the query, right? The persist query.
So the query comes in into the.
Let's say I've got the string query.
Mm-hmm.
Then I want to do the SQL exec, and then just give it.
Yeah, so the SQL would have to be written that like when you get this type of query, like give me the first 10 rows in this database, you'd have to have a corresponding like function in your code that like knows to do that select star from.
The question was, is there a GraphQL .exec that just takes your query thing?
Like converts GraphQL to SQL?
Well, I'll give you an example. So let's say I've got a Databricks database that has a JDBC connector to it.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say. So if I'm doing Java and I'm using JPA, I just connect to the JDBC connector that's Databricks. I don't have to care about what it is, right? And then from there, I just have a query string, and then I just execute with JPA. That's it. So for GraphQL, is there something equivalent? Like what exactly?
Yeah, so that's when you use resolvers.
Resolver?
Yeah, so when I explain it to backend architecture, it'll make sense.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So let me keep going. Okay. So you think REST server, you think CRUD. So you have create, read, update, delete. So with GraphQL, a query is R, so it's the read, and then a mutation is create, update, and delete. So it can do either of them, like any of those. So it's like query is R, mutations is CUD. Okay. So there used to be something called GraphQL, but they've actually updated it, and now they call it GraphQL Playground. It exposes a way to play with your GraphQL server directly. So I've actually, right now, I wrote a little tiny node server that, and I'll go over this, that's hosting a GraphQL server. So you actually can't see it because internally it's doing all of the, and how well can people read this code in the back? All right, I'll zoom in a little bit more. Okay. So I'm running a REST server, and then in here I'm using an Apollo server, which is a GraphQL server, and it's going to expose a REST endpoint that will handle GraphQL requests. So basically, this is how GraphQL looks like. It looks like JSON. And so basically, I'm saying, hey, I have a query, and I want to get all posts. So posts, this is basically just think of this as a blog. So on the front end, I have this pretty good blog that has random things in here. And it's all stored in memory, so if I kill my server, it's going to die. So that's all it does. You just have a couple entries, hello world, how to learn React, how to learn GraphQL. So I have a happy server, and I want to play with my GraphQL server, and I want to play with my data without having to go through a web or like write the code to do it. I can just play with it with this thing called GraphQL Playground. So what's cool is it gives you back exactly what you ask for it. So this is where like the strong typeness comes from. So I'm saying, hey, give me all posts. So you saw the post right here, right? It says, so there's the title, and then there's the body. So title, how to learn GraphQL, body, if you want to learn GraphQL, yada, yada. So on my React code, which I'll get into later, I say, hey, I want the title and body. Right here, I can just say like, oh, I only want the title, I only want the body. So in this example, they're both coming from the same store, but there could be an example where one's coming from one store and one's coming from the other store. An app that I was working on at Walmart was consolidating vendor management, and vendors' data is just like sprinkled all throughout Walmart's infrastructure. So we had to like go chase down other teams and be like, hey, where's this data? And get permission. We like had to get a subscription to their data. And then we registered our GraphQL server to be able to grab that data. So then we would ask for something like OTIF score. It would say on time in full, meaning how many times do you get here? And so all we'd have to do is we'd write OTIF, and it would just give it to us with all of our other data. So how does this work? Okay, now let's actually figure out how that works. So basic example, I already have a file called arch.tt. So basic example, you have your REST server. You have your REST server. This has a GraphQL endpoint. So I'm talking about like the request lifecycle that something comes in. So it has a REST server. It goes to your GraphQL endpoint. And then it's going to go to your resolvers. And then your resolvers, you're going to have resolvers for things like posts or your body or title. So these resolvers know how to resolve each individual thing. So when I ask for body, unless posts has a resolver that resolves body for you, body can have its own resolver. So you have resolvers, and then the next layer you'd want is connectors. So if you think of connectors, so in regular REST server architecture, you have something like database access objects, right? So your DAOs, that all they do is access the database, and that's all they care about. If you think about a connector, all the connectors do is connect to something, and that's all you care about. So it could connect to a database, it could connect to a REST server, connect to another database. That's all you think about. So you generally want to do like a CRUD connector for everything. Like you would create on this as a endpoint, read, update, delete. And then your resolvers can call multiple connectors. So say you wanted to, say you created a post. And then in that post resolver, you would create it, and then you get back the ID. And then you would do a get where it gives you like the whole body because you wanted to return everything. So your resolver would have multiple connectors in it, and then your connector just has one responsibility. Okay, so let's actually like look at this. So we have a server, and the server has two things that it takes in. It takes in type definitions and resolvers. So first we have this schema. So here's where you get the types. It looks really similar like TypeScript. So let's look at that. Well, and it goes well. Oh. Okay, so you see on my left, right, I have the post's body title. So I have this query called posts, and I'm saying, hey, I'm going to return an array of posts, of post. And then that array has things like ID, title, and body. And then I didn't ask for ID, so I didn't get it. But now I asked for it. Go away. OK, so now I get it. So go ahead.
What exactly is GraphQL? Is it a database with a schema?
It's not a database.
It's not.
It's a language.
It's a language. And it looks like it's a JSON formatted language, sort of?
Almost JSON. Almost JSON, yeah.
And I see a schema on the left with the localhost 4000 GraphQL. So what is that telling us?
So localhost 4000 is a REST server, and it's hosting a GraphQL endpoint. And it knows that when, hey, I receive a certain string formatted a certain way, I'm going to take that, and I know what to do with it because you have given me a schema and resolvers. And given a certain string, I'm going to resolve and do certain things.
And what are you doing with it? Are you storing the string data that has that schema? Like some of the ID, body, and title?
So in the type defs, it says right here, like, hey, when you give me posts, so you see posts on the left, and then you see my schema on the right, posts.
Yeah.
So I have a query, and I have posts. And then it says, hey, this is an array of posts.
Yeah.
And so I can have ID, title, or body. OK? So on the server, I pass in the type defs, and I pass in my resolvers. So it takes in the type defs, and then it's like, OK, now I need to know resolvers to be able to resolve when I have these certain types that come in. So let's go to the resolvers. So basically, when it says, hey, when I get posts, I'm going to do postResolvers.getPost. It's a one-to-one function mapping. So when I ask for posts, this getPost is going to get invoked.
Right.
OK? So now I have this getPosts, and then all I do is I have my connector getPosts, and it just calls connectors.getPost. And this is just like a sleep just to mimic like a server because it's all local. Yeah.
So my question was, you've got that set of, structs in your code here.
Yeah.
And you're forming the message. Is that right? Is there a part where you're filling in the body of the message, and then you post the message to the server?
So
Are you doing kind of the equivalent of a REST post?
yes. So it is a REST post.
Okay, so you're forming the message, and you've got the message format defined in your code,
Mm-hmm.
and then you build in the payload of the message, and then you post it with the CRUD operation.
So you post it. You post this.
It's equivalent of like an update or a post.
Yeah, it's just a post, but with GraphQL post, it's just what you use.
Right.
So
Do you have the piece where you filled in the message itself?
that's part of the new Apollo server where it's using typedef and resolvers. that
I
it,
was looking for sort of the equivalent of hello world in body and title.
well, that's not in here.
Okay.
Okay.
So you haven't given an example where you're giving it a test case with real live data yet
Well, so this is it right here.
on the left.
Yeah, so this is a GraphQL query. I run it, and then I get back data.
And where did the data come from?
The data came from a pretend database. So in my connectors file, I just have a Redux store, just like stored in memory. So like I was saying, you want to create CRUD actions for all your connectors. So I have a posts database, which is just a Redux store. Please don't do that in production. This is just for what is a talk without a contrived example.
I saw it. I saw the IDs.
IDs?
I thought I saw the ID code.
So this is what happens. A request comes in. It comes to /GraphQL. Because I define type defs and I define resolvers, my GraphQL server is going to know what to do with this request, how it's shaped like this. So it comes in and it sees this posts right here. And it's going to say, hey, let me look at your resolvers. So it looks at this post and it says, oh, you wanted posts. So I'm going to invoke this function, postResolvers.getPosts. Okay? So it comes into here and it's like, hey, I'm going to post this. And it says, oh, you're giving me a presentation, so you need to sleep for 500 milliseconds. And then it says, OK, now I'm going to call your connectors, get posts. OK, so it does the connectors.getPosts, and then all it returns is just like the posts in Redux. So usually this connector would be like a Mongo database or something. OK, so that's the basic like back-end example. I lost my React example. OK, so now I'm going to go ahead and talk about React. So like I said, like perfect example you could be in is you just have this GraphQL server handed to you. I mean, obviously that would be like amazing, but and all you have to worry about is the front end. So working with GraphQL on the front end is it's a treat. It's pretty nice. So like Redux, you need a top-level provider. So for those of you not familiar with React and context API, so basically you have a provider, and then anything, so on line 25, I have a provider, and then any child, any descendant of the thing in between my provider, they can access pieces of me if they want to. So this is where if you're a wrapped in a provider, you can do mutations and you can do queries. So so queries are gets, mutations are the other ones. And so basically what you want to do is you want to create basic files. So you want to have like a queries file and mutations file just to start. And then you can have all these kinds of different things where you can do your delete, create, and update. What's also cool about Apollo is that it also supports a client-side GraphQL library. And I said earlier, like you can't do client-side GraphQL, but Apollo knows how to interpret its own GraphQL. It understands GraphQL specs, so you can make GraphQL queries towards yourself. So you can batch other things like in your queries. So let me show you that. So if you look at this post, so when I refresh the page, I get all my posts. I get the ID, the body, and the title, and it's an array. And then the other thing I say is like, hey, are you connected like to the network? And then I say, hey, this is on the client. Like all I care about is this being on the client. And then GraphQL knows like, hey, Apollo knows, hey, like because this is like on the client, I'm going to return it to you, but not hit the server for this part. So how that works is when you set it up, it's the same idea that you have resolvers on the front end now. And then, and so basically, so now if you do is connected, it will return this. So I have a client state, and I say, hey, here's my is connected true. And so now I can make queries that say like, hey, are you connected? And I say it's the client, and it'll return true. And then I have an update network status that I can write to and do mutations. So let me show a basic add post. So here's a lot of code. So the idea is you have a mutation. So let's focus right here. So you have a mutation. You take in create post. So create post is just So it's just text. So it's like you have your template literals where you take in title and body, and then what you want to do is you say, I want ID, body, and title, and this is what you'll get back. So you do create post, and then you get back ID, body, and title. So then, after it's done, you get back the result called create post. And then, so locally, you have something called cache. Well, like people know what cache is, but so there's an Apollo cache, and then you can update your query, like your local version of the cache with saying like, hey, when I ran get posts, I want you to update the data that's in there. So if you have data that's stored, like, so say your tree has diverged, and now you have somebody else in your React component tree that is not necessarily near you, but it's still underneath your provider. If you update the provider's cache, and it's going to trickle down to the other component, so you don't have to worry about like storing that in Redux and like trying to fire it to the other one. You can just do it with updating the cache. Okay, so
Can anybody post to it?
Can anybody post to what?
To the GraphQL server?
So I mean that's just like now it's just like REST, because it's just a REST server. So if anybody can post to your REST server, then anybody can post to your GraphQL server. So it's the same idea. So it's up to you. Okay. What's also nice let me show you queries. So you have queries. So the query syntax is really fun. My experience with Redux was you would like do a thunk or a saga, and you'd be like, hey, I'm doing something, and then I'm loading, and then you have these components that are like, hey, if I'm loading, do this. If I'm loading, do that. Whereas with GraphQL, when you use Apollo, you just have a query component, and all you do is you take in a query, and then it uses render props where it exposes directly, like if you're loading. So loading, everybody saw that, right? Yeah, okay. So if there's loading, then I say this, and then why don't we do that just to, yeah, no dot, dot, dot. Okay, so, and if there's an error, then I'll return an error, say that there's a frowny face. So if I kill this, frowny face. And then I'm guessing it will come back up. So what's also cool is that the query, if you are trying to ship fast, I wouldn't recommend this for like an enterprise thing where you have millions of customers. So all you have to do is you can attach this poll interval 1000, and your query will rerun itself every poll interval. There also is a way to do sockets, but if you're in a, yeah, I would definitely say if this was a low-scale project, use the poll interval. So basically, and then so you have your either loading or you have an error, and then or you could do now once you have the data, then you just display the data. And then the same thing applies for the edit post, where you have it's called update post, where you have a mutation, it takes in the same idea. So you make a mutation, you update, and then when you update, you need to rewrite to the cache. So like when I update this, let's delete the exclamation. So deleting the exclamation, what's going to happen is, oh, I know why that is. Update post. Click submit. And then right here, I have access to all the other cache. And if I can't. Oh, that is. So Apollo has written it. Actually, Apollo just got like $20 million in funding, so that's cool. So they've written like a really, looks very efficient caching mechanism. So you can see the cache and you can play with it right here. So if there's like any issues, you can just put a breakpoint right here and see what's going on. And so you can say like, hey, I'm going to write a query, do this, and I'm going to update my get posts. And I'm going to add it with my new posts because I just updated the post. And the reason that I know I'm getting posts back is that I can just look at my my query or my mutation, and I know exactly what I returned. So I have like a minute and a half left. Lastly, I want to talk about testing. So like we have a provider that sits at the top of your application where React.DOM.render occurs, basically, you can also do a mocked provider where you can, you don't have to mock your network. You can basically just mock your queries, and that sits above your tests. And so what you can do is you can say like, hey, here's all my mocks. So I say when I get posts as a query, then my result, I know, oh, I'm going to return all these things with it. So it's pretty straightforward. It can get kind of confusing because like if it's like you need to be incremental. Go ahead.
So let's say you execute this set of tests, right?
Yeah.
And then you go back to that screen where you were showing the GraphQL server, right?
Uh-huh.
Is this where your vectors are coming from? Your test vectors?
No, so this is just locally, like I'm running in Jest.
But can those test vectors get?
They can hit your network, but then you have to have your server, but you have to have your server running.
Okay, so let's say it is running. Will those vectors get written?
If it's exposed so that you can have it hit that, then you can have it hit it. It's up to you.
So
Yeah.
it's just like a REST host in essence.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And then lastly, so this is using React testing library. I've had no complaints with it, and I found it amazing so far. So if you are writing your tests and you feel like you have had to rewrite them because they've been breaking because you just migrated hooks and you've been writing tests wrong this entire time, and I would really recommend using React testing library.